The orange envelope landed on the desk between us with a sound so small it should not have been able to change a life. Ms. Vickers kept one hand on the keyboard and never looked at me. Your transitional placement ends at noon tomorrow, Mara. The program already approved the extension twice. Tomorrow was my 21st birthday. 3 years earlier, I had aged out of foster care with 2 trash bags, a state identification card, and a promise that the system would help me transition. What that promise had actually bought was a basement apartment in Birmingham, a case manager who changed every 6 months, and just enough time to become the legal guardian of my little brother before the rent clock ran out. I opened the envelope. Inside was a motel list, a bus map, a voucher for one night at a family shelter, and a check for $312. $312. That was the official value of our next chapter. I folded the check once and put it in my jacket pocket. What happens to Owen if I don't find a place? I asked. That finally made her look at me, not cruelly, worse, professionally. Your guardianship review is in 6 weeks. Stable housing is one of the conditions. The room seemed to tilt. Owen was 14. He had already lost our father, our mother, 2 foster homes, and most of his voice. I had spent 2 years taking parenting classes, sleeping through double shifts, answering questions about my income, my temper, my childhood, and every mistake I had ever made. I had fought a court full of strangers for the right to keep my own brother. Now a lease expiration could hand him back. I stood. Thank you for explaining it. Ms. Vickers nodded as if we had completed a transaction. Outside, the August heat hit me like an open oven. Owen sat on the curb beside our truck with Atlas stretched across his boots. The truck was a faded green 1997 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and an air conditioner that worked only when the engine was already cool. It had belonged to our father. The Army had shipped it home with his duffel after he was killed in Afghanistan 9 years earlier. Atlas had come home 3 weeks after that. He had been a military working dog then, lean, hard-eyed, trained to search rooms and roads before human beings walked into them. By the time the paperwork finally placed him with our family, he had a gray patch on his muzzle and a scar that ran from his left shoulder to the middle of his chest. He had slept outside Owen's bedroom every night since, even in foster homes that said no dogs, even in one place where the foster father chained him to a shed. Atlas had chewed through the rope before sunrise and sat outside Owen's window until somebody let him in. Now he raised his head when he saw my face. Owen did too. He had our father's dark eyes and our mother's habit of studying people before deciding whether they were safe. "Well?" he asked. I forced my voice to stay level. "We have until noon tomorrow." He looked at the 2 boxes already packed in the truck bed. Then he looked at me. "Are they splitting us up?" "No," I said it too fast. Owen heard the fear underneath it, but he nodded anyway. Atlas stood and pressed his shoulder against Owen's leg. I crouched in front of them. "We're leaving tonight. We'll use the shelter voucher if we have to. I'll call every listing between here and Montgomery. I'll figure it out." Owen stared at the hot pavement. "You always say that." "What, that you'll figure it out?" He swallowed. "What if one day you can't?" I had no answer that would not be a lie, so I reached for his hand. "Then we figure it out together." By 6 that evening, everything we owned was in the truck. 2 boxes of clothes, 1 milk crate of school books, a saucepan, a framed photograph of our parents on the courthouse steps the day they got married, Atlas's food, and our father's old canvas duffel, still buckled shut. I had carried that duffel through 4 addresses without opening it. I told myself I was saving it for the right day. The truth was, some grief feels safer when it stays zipped. We drove south with the windows down, because the air conditioner gave up before we reached the interstate. I called 12 landlords. 4 numbers were disconnected. 3 apartments had already been rented. 2 would not take a dog over 40 pounds. 1 wanted first month, last month, and a deposit totaling $2,600. The last woman listened until I mentioned guardianship, then said the unit was not suitable for children. By midnight, Owen was asleep against the passenger door with Atlas's head in his lap. I pulled into a truck stop outside Greenville, Alabama, parked beneath a light, and counted our money. $312 from the state, $87 from my checking account, $40 in cash, enough for gas, food, and maybe 3 nights in the cheapest motel I could find. Not enough for a home. The call came at 12:18 in the morning. Area code 229. I almost ignored it. Then it rang again. Hello? May I speak with Mara Bell? The man's voice was old and measured, with a kind of southern accent that did not hurry even when the words mattered. This is Mara. My name is Samuel Rourke. I'm an attorney in Hazel Run, Georgia. I apologize for calling so late, but I have been trying to locate you for nearly 7 months. I sat up. Is this about Owen? In a way. It concerns both of you. Paper shifted on his end of the line. Ms. Bell, your grandfather, Amos Bell, died in January. I thought I had misheard him. My grandfather? Yes, my father said his parents were dead. A long breath came through the phone. Your father said many things after he left Hazel Run. Some of them were true. Some were the sort of things young men say when pain becomes easier to carry as anger. The cab felt suddenly too small. Owen stirred but did not wake. Mr. Rourke continued. Amos named you and Owen as the equal beneficiaries of his estate. The estate includes the house, the packing barn, farm equipment, and 58 acres known as Red Cedar Orchard. I stared through the windshield at the black parking lot. A refrigerated truck idled 3 spaces away. Somewhere, a man laughed near the fuel pumps. The whole world kept moving as if a stranger had not just told me I owned 58 acres. I think you have the wrong family. I have your father's birth certificate in front of me. Caleb Amos Bell. Born in Hazel Run on November 4th, 1984. I have your parents' marriage record. I have your guardianship petition for Owen, and I have a photograph of you at age 6 that your grandfather kept on his desk until the day he died. My fingers tightened around the phone. How did he get my picture? Your mother sent it to him. That hurt in a place I did not know existed. My mother knew him. She wrote once. Then the contact stopped. There is more to explain, and I would rather not do it over the telephone. He gave me the address of his office. Hazel Run was 2 hours and 40 minutes east. I can be there in the morning, I said. Mr. Rourke was quiet. Then, very softly, he said, your grandfather spent 14 years trying to bring you home. Please drive carefully. He would not forgive me if you got hurt on the last miles. The call ended. For a long time, I held the dark phone against my chest. Atlas lifted his head from Owen's lap and looked at me. The old dog's amber eyes did not ask questions. They waited. I turned the key. Where are we going? Owen mumbled. I pulled onto the highway. To meet a man who says we have a home. Hazel Run appeared just after 8 the next morning. It was not much more than a courthouse square, a feed store, 2 churches, a hardware shop, and a row of brick storefronts shaded by live oaks. The town clock above the bank was 7 minutes slow. Someone had tied yellow ribbons around the lampposts for a high school football player leaving for college. Mr. Rourke's office occupied the 2nd floor above a pharmacy. Before we went in, Owen asked for a bathroom, so we crossed to a diner called Pearl's Table. The woman behind the counter had silver braids pinned into a crown and a pencil tucked behind one ear. Her name tag said Pearl. She looked at Atlas first, then at the faded name tape stitched above the pocket of my father's field jacket. Bell, her coffee pot stopped in midair. You children belong to Caleb. I felt Owen move closer to me. You knew our father. Miss Pearl set the pot down. I knew him before the army taught him to stand straight. She came around the counter and studied my face. Lord have mercy. You have Dana's mouth. Nobody outside the system had said my mother's name in 5 years. Miss Pearl did not ask permission before pulling us both into her arms. The hug was firm and smelled like coffee, flour, and peppermint. When she let go, her eyes were wet. Sam is waiting upstairs. But you are not walking into that office hungry. 10 minutes later, Owen had eggs, grits, and biscuits in front of him. Atlas had a bowl of water and 2 pieces of bacon Miss Pearl claimed had fallen by accident. I could barely eat. Why did my father leave? I asked. Miss Pearl wiped the counter slowly. Because his father told him love was not enough to build a life on. What does that mean? It means Amos Bell was wrong, and Caleb was too proud to wait for him to admit it. She glanced toward the window. Sam will tell you the rest. Some stories belong to the people who carried them. Mr. Rourke was 76, narrow as a fence post, and dressed in a tan suit despite the heat. He stood when we entered, but for several seconds he seemed unable to speak. He looked at Owen, then at me, then at Atlas. The whole Bell line just walked into my office, he whispered. He came around the desk and offered his hand. I expected a lawyer's grip. Instead, he held on with both hands. Welcome to Hazel Run. On the conference table sat a metal deed box, a ring of keys, and a photograph. I picked up the photograph first. My father was 19. He stood in the middle of a pecan orchard with one arm around a broad-shouldered man in work clothes. Both of them were laughing. Behind them, long rows of trees disappeared into summer light. That's Amos, Mr. Rourke said. Your grandfather. Owen touched the corner of the picture. They look happy. They were, before they forgot how to bend. Mr. Rourke opened the deed box. Red Cedar Orchard had belonged to the Bell family since 1948. My great-grandparents bought the first 22 acres after my great-grandfather came home from the Pacific. Amos added land 1 parcel at a time. The property now held 41 acres of mature pecan trees, 6 acres of peaches, a farmhouse, a packing barn, a well, and a family cemetery on the North Ridge. 742 mature pecan trees, 48 peach trees old enough to bear. Property taxes paid through the following February. No mortgage recorded on the title. My mind kept catching on the phrase no mortgage, then on 742 trees, then on family cemetery. What is the catch? I asked. Mr. Rourke did not pretend not to understand. The orchard has been neglected. Amos's health failed during the last 2 years. The irrigation lines need work. The packing barn roof leaks. The pecan buyer who used to contract with Amos has not renewed. How much money is in the estate? After medical bills and funeral expenses, $9,600. That is not enough to run a farm. No. Then why leave it to us? Mr. Rourke looked at the photograph. Because it was the only apology he had left. He told us the rest. At 20, my father had fallen in love with Dana Price, a nursing student whose mother cleaned houses and whose father had served time for check fraud. Amos believed the Price family would drag Caleb down. He told my father he would inherit the orchard only if he ended the relationship. My father packed his truck that night. My mother went with him. They married in Birmingham and never returned. For 12 years, Amos sent letters through mutual friends, old addresses, church directories, and eventually investigators. My father returned everyone. After Dad was killed, my mother wrote Amos once. She sent the photograph of me. She said she was trying to decide whether to let him back into our lives. Then fear, grief, and pride closed the door again. When our mother died, Amos petitioned for kinship placement. The petition never reached the right judge. A clerk entered Owen's last name as Price instead of Bell, attached the wrong child welfare case number, and filed Amos's background check in a closed case 3 counties away. By the time Mr. Rourke discovered the error, Amos was already in heart failure. He came to Birmingham twice, Mr. Rourke said. The agency would not tell him where you were because he was not approved kin. He hired another investigator. Then he had a stroke. I sat very still. A paperwork error. Not a dramatic conspiracy. Not a person standing in a dark room deciding we did not deserve family. Just one wrong name typed into one wrong box. The kind of mistake nobody remembers making. The kind children build whole lives around. Owen stared at the photograph. Did he stop trying? Mr. Rourke's face folded. No, son. He did not. He slid the ring of keys toward us. Come see what he kept waiting for. Red Cedar Orchard sat 12 miles outside town, at the end of a clay road lined with loblolly pines. The front gate leaned toward the ditch. A rusted metal sign hung from one chain, Red Cedar Orchard, A. Bell and Son. The word son had faded almost white. Atlas stood with his paws on the truck door and began to whine. It was the first sound he had made all morning. The house appeared beyond the trees. It was a wide, low farmhouse with a deep porch, green shutters, and a tin roof burned pale by the sun. One corner of the porch had dropped 3 inches. Wisteria climbed a broken trellis. The yard had grown high enough to hide the stepping stones, but the orchard behind it was alive. Rows of pecan trees stood in deep green lines, their branches meeting overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. Sunlight broke through in shifting coins. The ground beneath them was dry, silvered with grass and scattered with last season's shells. Owen got out before I stopped the truck. Atlas jumped after him and ran toward the house. Not wildly, purposefully. He climbed the porch steps, crossed to the door, and sat. His ears were forward. His tail struck the boards once, then again. I had seen Atlas alert to explosives, fear, and strangers. I had never seen him look relieved. Mr. Rourke handed me the brass front door key. "It is yours," he said. My hand shook so badly, I missed the lock the first time. The door opened into a long hallway. The house smelled of cedar, old paper, and dust. Photographs covered the walls. Bell men in army uniforms, women standing beside baskets of pecans, children on tractors, wedding portraits. Harvest crews. A family I had never known arranged itself in frames, generation after generation, as if it had been waiting for us to walk between them. At the end of the hall was a picture of Owen and me. It had been taken at a county fair the summer before our mother died. I remembered the day. Owen had blue cotton candy in his hair. I was wearing a red shirt and pretending I was too old for the Ferris wheel. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, were 4 words. "For when you are ready." I sat on the floor. Owen lowered himself beside me. Atlas lay across our feet. The house was silent except for the ticking of a clock in the kitchen. "I think she wanted us to find him," Owen said. "Maybe. Why didn't she?" I looked at our mother's handwriting until it blurred. Maybe wanting and being ready are not the same thing. That afternoon, the first neighbors arrived. Ruth and Henry Calder lived on the adjoining cattle farm. Ruth brought chicken pot pie, 2 gallons of sweet tea, and a bucket of cleaning supplies. Henry brought a toolbox and walked the porch with the solemn attention of a doctor examining a patient. "The roof is sound," he announced. "Porch is ugly, not dead. Well, pump needs a new pressure switch. Barn roof will cost you." "How much?" I asked. He rubbed his jaw. "If neighbors do the labor, materials might run 6,000. I nearly laughed. 6,000 might as well have been 6 million. Ruth took my hand. "One problem at a time, honey. That is how farms survive." Over the next week, Hazel Run came to us. Miss Pearl brought freezer meals. The pastor from New Hope Baptist brought Amos's worn Bible and did not ask us to attend church. A retired agriculture teacher named Mr. Cruz walked the orchard and marked the trees showing signs of scab. A mechanic repaired the truck's alternator and refused payment because my father had once pulled his son from a wrecked car. People sat on the porch and told stories about Amos. He had loaned equipment and forgotten to ask for it back. He had kept a freezer full of venison for families who would not accept charity. He had a temper that could peel paint. He had spent Christmas Eve every year leaving sacks of pecans on widows' porches. He had attended every high school football game even after Caleb left, sitting alone in the same seat. Every story gave him shape. Not a saint, not a villain. A difficult man who had loved badly, regretted deeply, and kept trying long after there was any guarantee his effort would matter. On the 6th day, I opened my father's duffel. The canvas smelled faintly of dust and machine oil. Inside were uniforms, a shaving kit, a folded American flag, 3 notebooks, and a small brass key taped beneath the bottom seam. A paper tag was tied to it. HR Office, Box 114. Mr. Rourke went pale when I showed him. Amos kept that box for years, he said. I thought he closed it. The post office stood beside the courthouse. Box 114 was low to the floor. The brass key turned reluctantly. Inside was a canvas mail sack. It was heavy. We carried it to the counter and opened it. 31 envelopes lay inside. Every one was addressed to either Mara Bell, Owen Bell, or both. Everyone had been returned. New, plain lace. Confidential address. No off. Case number not. The oldest letter was dated 14 years earlier. The newest had been mailed 2 months before Amos died. My hands went numb. Mr. Rourke looked at the postmaster. Why were these in the box? The postmaster checked the account notes. Standing instruction from Mr. Bell. Any returned correspondence was to be placed here. He renewed the box every year. I opened the oldest envelope on the courthouse steps. My dearest Mara, today you are 7 years old. I know this because I have counted every year I missed, and a man learns to count carefully when the number is made of regret. I do not know whether you like horses, books, thunderstorms, or peaches. I do not know whether you look like your father when you are angry. I do not know whether you have been told my name. But I know this. There is a room in my house with a window facing east. I have kept it painted. I have kept the roof over it sound. I have kept the orchard alive. A root does not chase after the tree it belongs to. It holds the ground and waits. I am waiting. Your grandfather, Amos Bell Owen, sat beside me and opened the next letter. Then another. We read until the courthouse clock struck 5. Birthday letters, Christmas letters. A letter written after Dad died. The ink smeared where Amos had rested his hand too soon. A letter written after our mother died. A letter written the week he filed for kinship placement. Some were angry at himself. Some were hopeful. Some contained weather reports, harvest numbers, and ordinary details. The Eastern Bloc produced 58,000 pounds that year. A storm took down 7 trees. Miss Pearl's peach cobbler still had too much cinnamon. The room was ready. The roof was sound. He was waiting. That night, Owen spoke for nearly an hour. He asked what kind of boy Dad had been. He asked whether Amos knew about Atlas. He asked if we could keep the east bedroom. He asked if roots could die from waiting too long. I told him I did not know. But in the darkness, the orchard clicked and whispered against the screens. It sounded alive enough to answer for itself. For 3 weeks we worked. Henry taught Owen to drive the old utility tractor in low gear. Ruth taught me how to sort early pecans from last season's spoiled nuts. Mr. Cruz helped us apply for a small agricultural rehabilitation grant. Mr. Rourke found a cooperative in Albany willing to inspect the crop. The numbers were not miraculous. That mattered. The orchard was not a hidden fortune. It was work. 41 acres of mature pecans could produce anywhere from 35,000 to 70,000 pounds depending on weather, disease, and harvest timing. Even in a good year, equipment, labor, fuel, fertilizer, and processing would take most of the check. But the orchard could carry its taxes. It could pay for repairs slowly. It could become a home that did not depend on a program extension. Owen started sleeping through the night. He stopped flinching when trucks slowed near the gate. He began drawing plans for repairing the packing barn. Then Clayton Vale arrived. His black SUV looked polished enough to reflect the whole farmhouse. He stepped out wearing a navy suit, no tie and shoes that sank slightly into the red clay. He was in his early 50s, silver at the temples, with the calm smile of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. "Miss Bell," Atlas moved between us before I answered. Vale glanced at the dog, then at the house. Clayton Vale. Vale Ridge Holdings. "First, let me say how sorry I was to hear about Amos. He was an institution in this county. You knew him." "I knew of him." He removed a leather folder from the SUV. "I represent a private note secured by this property. Amos borrowed $164,000 18 months before his death. The balance, with accrued interest and fees, is now $191,440. He handed me the folder. The first page was titled Deed to Secure Debt. It carried Amos Bell's name. It carried a signature. It carried a notary stamp. For a moment, all I heard was blood in my ears. Mr. Rourke had said there was no mortgage on the title. Vale spoke gently. The note was filed late. That happens with private agricultural lending. I understand this may come as a shock. What happens if it is real? You have 45 days before foreclosure proceedings begin. Owen had come onto the porch. Vale saw him and softened his voice further. I do not want to displace a family. Vale Ridge is prepared to satisfy the debt and pay you $48,000 for a voluntary transfer. Cash closing. No litigation. You could leave with enough money for an apartment and a reliable vehicle. $48,000. For a girl who had started the month with 312, it was the first number that sounded like rescue. That was why I distrusted it. "What does your company want with an orchard?" I asked. Vale's smile did not move. "We assemble land for regional development." "What kind?" "Warehousing, solar, residential. Depends on the market." Behind him, the Pecan rows stretched toward the ridge, 58 acres at the edge of a planned highway expansion. He did not see a house. He saw a rectangle. "I will have my lawyer review it." Of course, he gave me a card. "Just remember, litigation consumes time and money. The offer expires in 10 days. He walked back to the SUV. Atlas watched him leave without barking. The hair along his spine stood up one ridge at a time. Mr. Rourke arrived 20 minutes later. He read the documents at the kitchen table, once, twice, then a third time with a magnifying glass. "This lien was recorded 6 weeks after Amos died," he said. "Can they do that?" "They can record almost anything if the clerk accepts the filing. Recording does not make it valid." He turned to the legal description. "Look here. A parcel identification number ran beneath the acreage description, 06 and 7B. So, that parcel number did not exist 18 months before Amos died. The county split the original tract for tax mapping last summer, after the date on this supposed loan." I felt the room sharpen. "You are saying whoever made this document used a number from the future?" "I am saying it was backdated." He pointed to the notary seal. "And I know this name. Lorna Mayfield retired 3 years ago. Her commission expired before this document was supposedly signed." Owen came closer. "So it is fake?" "Yes," Mr. Rourke said. "But fake papers can still take real property if nobody fights them fast enough." We went to the county records office the next morning. The clerk pulled the electronic image of the lien. Vale Ridge Holdings had filed it 41 days after Amos's death, along with an affidavit claiming the original loan documents had been discovered during portfolio reconciliation. The filing fee had been paid by a law office in Macon. The return address led to a mailbox store. Mr. Rourke filed an emergency petition to stop the foreclosure. Vale Ridge responded the same afternoon. They denied fraud. They produced a payment schedule. They claimed Amos had received the loan in cash installments because he distrusted banks. And they requested attorney fees if we challenged the debt without good cause. The hearing date was set for 32 days later. That should have felt like progress. Instead, the orchard began closing around us. The cooperative suspended our crop inspection until the title dispute was resolved. The rehabilitation grant was placed on hold. The insurance company refused to bind a full farm policy while a contested lien existed. Then my guardianship caseworker called. Ms. Vickers had received notice of the foreclosure. If the property is not legally secure at the time of review, the court may require an alternate housing plan for Owen. I stood in the orchard with the phone pressed to my ear. What alternate plan? License placement. The phrase was clean. Its meaning was not. Owen would go back, maybe to a foster home, maybe to a group facility, maybe somewhere that said Atlas could not come. I hung up and leaned against the nearest pecan tree, the bark pressed hard into my shoulder blades. For 3 years, I had believed the worst thing that could happen was having no home. I had been wrong. The worst thing was finding one and watching a man with a leather folder turn it back into an address the state could question. That evening, Vale called. His offer had increased to $60,000. Take it, he said. You are 21 years old. You do not have the capital to operate an orchard. You do not have the legal resources for prolonged litigation. And you have a minor child depending on you. My hand tightened around the phone. You checked my guardianship file. Public court records. You knew exactly where to press. I know how to solve problems. No, you know how to price fear. For the first time, the warmth left his voice. Fear is expensive, Ms. Bell. That is why practical people sell before it compounds. He ended the call. I sat at Amos's kitchen table until midnight. The letters were stacked beside me. 31 attempts to cross a system that had never cared enough to connect the names correctly. Outside, Owen and Henry were finishing a temporary patch on the packing barn roof under work lights. Atlas lay in the doorway, watching both of them. I opened the letter Amos wrote after our mother died. Mara, I have been told you are now responsible for Owen in ways no child should be responsible for another child. I cannot reach you. I cannot change that tonight. So I will tell you what I wish somebody had told your father. You do not prove love by carrying everything alone. Trees survive storms because their roots touch the same ground. If you ever come here, ask for help before the wind teaches you to. I read the last line twice. Then I called Mr. Rourke. I am not selling, he exhaled. Good, but I cannot pay you. You are not going to. Then who is? No one. Amos wrote my first legal recommendation when I was 26 and too poor to own a second suit. I have been waiting 50 years to return the favor. The next morning, we started building a case. Mr. Rourke recruited Tessa Reed, a 23-year-old records clerk studying for a paralegal certificate at night. Tessa had grown up 3 roads over from Red Cedar. Amos used to pay her $5 a bucket to collect fallen pecans when she was a child. She brought us access logs, filing indexes, and a talent for finding patterns adults had stopped noticing. We searched every deed recorded by Vale Ridge Holdings and 6 related companies over the previous 12 years. At first, the files looked ordinary: a loan, a default, a voluntary sale, a foreclosure. Then Tessa sorted them by the property owner's date of death. The pattern appeared: 8 estates, 8 rural properties, 1,306 acres. Every disputed loan had been recorded between 29 and 63 days after the owner died. Every loan was allegedly issued in cash. 5 used expired notary commissions. 3 contained parcel descriptions updated after the supposed signing date. The families had settled because the heirs lived out of state, the estates had little cash, or the surviving spouses were too sick to fight. Vale Ridge had acquired land worth at least $6.4 million for less than $1.1 million in payouts and assumed debt. This is not a lending business, Tessa said. She spread the timeline across Mr. Rourke's conference table. "It is an obituary business. We contacted the families. The first man hung up. The second cried. The third drove 3 hours with a box of documents his mother had saved beneath her bed. A widow named Inez Cooper showed us a loan that claimed her husband received $90,000 9 months after dementia had left him, unable to sign his own name. 2 brothers from Colquitt County brought a survey proving the parcel description in their father's lien had been created after the funeral. A retired nurse named Pauline Ross had kept a voicemail from Clayton Vale. His voice was smooth and patient. "You can accept $35,000 now," he told her, "or spend it all proving a dead man did not borrow money." The district attorney's office opened an investigation. An assistant district attorney named Camille West came to Red Cedar with 2 financial crimes investigators. They photographed the original envelopes, copied the deed box, and took the Vale Ridge documents for forensic examination. The ink and paper did not give them a miracle. The mechanism was simpler. Vale Ridge's payment ledger listed cash withdrawals from an account that did not exist until 4 months after the alleged loan. The notary stamp had been ordered online using a dead woman's commission number, and the same scanner defect, a thin gray line down the left margin, appeared on 6 supposedly unrelated loan documents. The fraud was not brilliant. It had survived because grief makes people tired, and tired people sign what powerful men put in front of them. The investigators asked us not to speak publicly. Hazel Run spoke anyway. Farmers began arriving at the courthouse to check old deeds. The feed store stopped accepting Vale Ridge business. Miss Pearl placed a jar on the diner counter labeled Red Cedar Legal Fund, even after Mr. Rourke told her we did not need one. Within a week, it held $2,800. Ruth used some of it to pay for a temporary farm insurance rider through a mutual company in another county. Henry convinced the cooperative to inspect the orchard without waiting for title clearance. The estimate came back at £47,000 if weather held. Not enough to make us rich, enough to pay taxes, replace the well pump, buy used harvesting tarps, and keep breathing. Owen changed during those weeks. He woke before dawn to meet Henry in the orchard. He learned how to test nuts for kernel fill. He repaired a section of irrigation line with clamps, stubbornness, and 3 trips to the hardware store. At school enrollment, he chose agricultural science. One evening I heard him laughing in the packing barn with Tessa's younger brothers. The sound stopped me in the doorway. For years, Owen's laughter had been something I remembered. Now it was coming from a room we owned. That was when I understood what Vale had miscalculated. He thought he was threatening land. He was threatening evidence. Evidence that Owen could still become a boy instead of a case number. Evidence that I could build something instead of merely avoid losing it. Evidence that Amos had not waited for nothing. The emergency hearing took place on a Tuesday in late September. The courtroom filled before 9. Ruth and Henry sat behind us. Miss Pearl wore a yellow church hat wide enough to block 2 rows. Mr. Cruz came with dirt still beneath his fingernails. The other family sat together on the left side, holding folders in their laps. Owen sat beside me in our father's blue button-down shirt. Atlas could not enter the courtroom, so he waited with a deputy in the shaded courtyard outside. Clayton Vale arrived with 3 attorneys. He did not look at the families. He looked at me and nodded, as if we were still negotiating. Judge Elena Brooks entered at 9:15. She was known for speaking quietly enough that everyone else lowered their voice. Mr. Rourke presented the impossible parcel number. He presented the expired notary commission. He presented the bank account creation date. Tessa testified about the 8-estate pattern. One by one, the families described the same sequence: a funeral, a lien, a deadline, a cash offer. a warning that fighting would cost more than surrender. Vale's lawyers argued that irregularities did not prove their client created the documents. They blamed a former portfolio manager nobody could locate. They said Vale Ridge had purchased the notes in good faith. Then Camille West asked permission to present newly obtained evidence. Judge Brooks allowed it. An investigator connected a laptop to the courtroom monitor. The screen showed security video from a mailbox store in Pecan. Clayton Vale walked into frame carrying a stack of envelopes. The date was 11 days after Amos Bell died. He opened a private mailbox using the same return address printed on the alleged loan notice. Then he fed documents into the store scanner. A thin gray line appeared down the left side of every page, the same defect found on the forged liens. Vale's face changed, not dramatically. The smile simply left and did not come back. Judge Brooks ordered a recess. The courtroom emptied into the hall. I stood near a window, too numb to speak. Vale approached before his lawyers could stop him. "You think this fixes your life?" he said under his breath. I looked at him. No. His jaw tightened. "You will still have a failing orchard. You will still owe taxes. You will still be raising a damaged child without money." The words hit exactly where he aimed them. For half a second, I was back in the basement apartment, counting dollars, waiting for a state employee to decide whether my brother could stay. Then Owen stepped beside me. "I am not damaged," he said. His voice was quiet, but the whole hallway heard it. Vale looked down at him. Owen did not move. "I was hurt," he said. "That is not the same thing." Mr. Rourke came to stand on Owen's other side. Then Ruth, then Henry, then Miss Pearl. Then the families Vale had expected to face one at a time. He had built his business on isolated grief. He had never planned for it to gather in one hallway. When court resumed, Judge Brooks ruled from the bench. The lien against Red Cedar Orchard was void. Vale Ridge was enjoined from foreclosure. The company was ordered to pay our legal costs and preserve all records related to the 8 estates. The judge referred the entire matter for criminal prosecution and a broader title review. Then she looked directly at Clayton Vale. "Property law depends on records," she said, "but records depend on trust. When someone weaponizes the record system against the dead and the grieving, the injury extends beyond a parcel line. It injures every person who must rely on a courthouse to tell the truth." She struck the gavel once. 2 investigators were waiting at the courtroom door. They served Vale with an arrest warrant for forgery, racketeering, and theft by deception. No one cheered. The family stood as he passed. Pauline Ross held the voicemail transcript against her chest. Inez Cooper closed her eyes. Owen reached for my hand. Outside, Atlas rose the moment he saw us. I knelt and buried my face in the rough fur at his neck. "We get to go home," I whispered. The criminal case would last another year. Vale eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts after 2 employees agreed to testify. A restitution fund was created from the sale of company assets. 3 farms were returned. 2 families received settlements because their land had already been developed. Other claims remained in court. Justice did not reverse every loss. It did stop the machine. For us, the first real victory came 6 weeks after the hearing when the Orchard Cooperative sent a harvesting crew down our rows. Mechanical shakers gripped the trunks. Branches trembled. Pecans fell in a hard, astonishing rain. Owen ran between the tarps laughing while Atlas barked at the sound. The final crop weighed 49,300 pounds. After processing fees, labor, fuel, repairs, and the cooperative share, the orchard cleared just under $22,000. Not a fortune. A beginning. We replaced the well pump. We repaired half the barn roof. We paid the next year's property taxes early. I enrolled in 2 evening classes in agricultural business at the community college. Owen joined the FFA chapter at school and spent 3 months building a pecan sorter from scrap lumber and bicycle parts. In November, the guardianship judge visited Red Cedar. She walked through the house. She reviewed the farm income. She spoke with Owen alone on the porch. Then she signed the order continuing my guardianship without additional housing conditions. I carried that paper home in a blue folder. It was the first government document in my life that felt like a door staying open. 8 months after we arrived, Hazel Run rebuilt the porch. It started with Henry announcing at the feed store that he needed 6 men on a Saturday. 67 people came. They brought lumber, paint, roofing tin, food, ladders, and enough extension cords to reach the state line. Ruth organized the kitchen. Miss Pearl ran the grill. Tessa labeled tools so nobody accidentally donated a socket wrench to the orchard. By sunset, the porch stood level. The packing barn had a new roof. The shutters were painted dark green again. Someone repaired the old sign at the gate, but they did not repaint it exactly as it had been. The new sign read, "Red Cedar Orchard Bell Family, no son, no single heir, no condition on who belonged." That evening, we ate at long tables beneath the pecan trees. Owen sat with boys from school, arguing about whether his homemade sorter needed a stronger motor. Atlas slept under Henry's chair. Mr. Rourke watched the crowd with tears in his eyes. Amos used to say orchards teach patience, he told me. I think Amos used to say a lot of things after it was too late. Mr. Rourke smiled. That is also true. He handed me a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed at the edges. I found this in his desk after the hearing. It was clipped behind your father's birth certificate. I believe he meant for you to read it after you decided whether to stay. I turned it over. For Mara and Owen, when Red Cedar is theirs by choice. I did not open it that night. Some words deserve a place. The following Sunday, Owen and I walked to the North Ridge. Atlas followed slowly. The family cemetery sat beneath 3 live oaks behind a low iron fence. The oldest marker belonged to our great-grandfather. The newest belonged to Amos. His stone was plain. Amos Caleb Bell, 1944-2024. He kept the ground beside it stood 2 newer markers. One for our father, whose body remained in a military cemetery near Fort Moore. Caleb Amos Bell, 1984-2015, beloved son, husband, father. The other was for our mother. We had not moved her remains. She still rested in Birmingham, near the hospital where she worked, and the apartment where she raised us. But we placed a marker for her at Red Cedar, because belonging did not have to erase where a person had lived. Dana Price Bell, 1986-2019. She kept her children together. Owen laid a handful of pecan leaves between the stones. Atlas lowered himself beside Dad's marker and rested his head on his paws. I opened Amos's final letter. Mara and Owen. If you are reading this, then the orchard belongs to you in the only way land can truly belong to anyone. Because you chose to care for it. I will not ask you to forgive me. Forgiveness is not an inheritance an old man gets to leave by instruction. I was proud when your father needed tenderness. I mistook control for protection. By the time I understood the difference, he had built a life too far away for my apology to reach. Your mother gave me 1 photograph and 1 sentence. She wrote, "They are safe, but safety is not the same as being surrounded." I have thought about that sentence every day. I tried to reach you. The letters came back. The court papers disappeared into the wrong file. My body became less useful. Still, I kept the eastern room painted. I kept the roof repaired. I kept the taxes paid. I kept the trees alive. Not because land can repair a family. It cannot. But a place can hold open a door. If you stayed, I hope Red Cedar gave you room to become more than what happened to you. If you sold it, I hope the money gave you freedom. If you walked away, I hope you did so without guilt. You owe me nothing. But you owe yourselves this truth. You were wanted before you knew where to look for the wanting. You were loved through every returned letter. And even when none of us knew how to reach one another, the roots remained in the ground. Your grandfather, Amos Owen, wiped his face with both hands. I wish he had found us sooner, he said. So do I. Do you forgive him? I looked at Amos's stone, then at Dad's, then at Mom's. I think I understand him more than I did. Owen nodded as if that was enough for now. We sat beneath the live oaks until the afternoon light turned gold. In the months that followed, life at Red Cedar became ordinary. That was its own kind of miracle. There were invoices, homework, broken belts on the tractor, rain at the wrong time, a freezer that quit during the hottest week of July, Owen's first school dance, my first college exam, after years of believing I was not smart enough for classrooms. Atlas began sleeping in the sun beside the packing barn, his working years finally behind him. The orchard did not rescue us all at once. It carried us in seasons. One harvest paid the taxes. Another replaced irrigation lines. A small peach crop covered Owen's braces. 5 years of careful work turned the packing barn into a licensed processing room. We began selling roasted pecans under a label Owen designed. A decade after I first opened the farmhouse door, Red Cedar employed 6 people during harvest and paid local growers through a small cooperative account. The land never became a fortune. It became something steadier. Proof measured in ordinary years. Proof that a one-time check can disappear, but a living system, trees, work, neighbors, knowledge, can keep producing long after the first crisis is over. Every August, on the night before my birthday, I took Amos's letters from the post office sack and read one. Not all 31, just one. Then I walked to the east bedroom, opened the window, and listened to the orchard move in the dark. For most of my life, I thought home was a place other people could remove me from. A lease, a placement, a file number, a room with a deadline. Red Cedar taught me something different. Home was not the house Amos left. It was the door he kept open. It was Owen laughing in the packing barn. It was Atlas asleep where he no longer had to guard anyone. It was a whole town standing in a courthouse hallway, so grief could not be picked off one family at a time. And beneath all of it, unseen but holding everything in place, were roots that had survived 14 years of returned letters. They had not chased us. They had simply refused to let the ground forget our names.